you.
Good morning. You can hear me. Thanks so much. So this is obviously a great topic, basically most of the topic of this conference. We're meeting in this moment where the United States is no longer treating the Western Hemisphere as a secondary theater, as we've been hearing for this whole time. And as someone who covers Latin America a lot in a national security context, for the last 12 years, it's been a very rare chance in Washington to really be able to cover that in a national security context, which has never been the case usually for Latin America. It's always a forgotten arena when it comes to being a priority for pretty much any US administration. Obviously, the Trump administration in the second term has really changed that. So, we speak a lot about the Monroe Doctrine, what that means. In Latin America, this tends to, press a lot of historic sensitivities, as we all know. It tends to kind of be seen as, invasion, as interference from the United States. When you speak to US officials in Washington, they're really kind of bringing it back to protecting the US influence sphere in their own hemisphere, looking back into its backyard, really making sure that it serves the United States and regional interests, and also keeping other external powers out, which was partly the original intent of the Monroe Doctrine. So, when you speak to Trump officials in Washington, those who've been around this for a long time, who are experts in this, definitely understand that they're often pressing a lot of those historic sensitivities with the president's rhetoric and actions when it comes to Panama, Cuba, Venezuela, and how that may be pushing some of these countries sometimes back into the arms of other external actors. So we've got a great panel here today. We've got Rafael Marrero, the founder of the Miami Strategic Intelligence Institute, Renee Novakoff, a senior fellow at FIU's Jack Gordon Institute for Public Policy, Vladimir Rouvinski. He's the director of the Laboratory of Politics and International Relations at ICESI University, and Vladimirov, the director of the Energy and Climate Program at the Center for the Study of Democracy. So to start and kind of set us off and set, I think, the stage, I would like to ask each of you what you think of when you think of how external powers are reshaping security in the Americas. Because I think many of us think of it in the old, outdated Cold War frame. That's what most of us grew up with. It obviously looks very different now. It's not just about bases or about even economic power. It's about so much more. So maybe starting with you, Rafael, when you look at it, what is the biggest concern? What is the biggest thing you're looking at when it comes to external powers?
Well, one of our main theses, good morning, and thank you for having us, by the way, and I'm honored to be here. So thank you to the Jack Gordon Institute, and thank you for having me on this panel. The first thing that comes to mind is that as we clearly state in our recent book, Chinese Social Imperialism, which is focused on the growing presence of China in LATAM, and Latin America and the Caribbean, is that China no longer needs armies just to have domination over a section and over a territory. And that's become a problem because we look at things conventionally just from a standpoint of troops, boots on the ground, armor, and when you really look at it, China has wisely and intelligently exploited the loopholes that we ourselves created by abandoning this theater of operations. We've created a vacuum, and they've been ably leveraging it against our very own interest. And as they have pointed out to me directly during my trips to China, well, if you let yourself be fooled, then shame on you. It's one of their very, very practical ways of looking at things. So part of the situation we find ourselves in today is the direct result of failed analyses, national intelligence estimates that were way off in their calculations. We can see that with the resurgence of Team B almost 50 years ago, right, and the competitive intelligence exercises there. China has positioned itself within everything. So 500 years after the initial conquest of the Americas, here we have a new form of imperialism, one that embeds itself in code, in debt trap, in organizational agreements and memorandums of understanding that seem to be harmless, that seem to be good-willed, and that are not forceful upon the nations that signed them, only to then find out that the people that really own and operate those ports are Chinese nationals, not locals, that you have no control over what happens in your own jurisdiction, such as in the case of Shanghai, such as what is happening right now in Southam. The bottom line is the PRC and the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, wants to rule the area. They've manifested their intentions very, very clearly. They want to dominate critical minerals, and we need to not react to things or think of LATAM as an afterthought, which I think has been part of the problem. Partly our arrogance, in part as a nation, and part of that whole reactive mode and the change in administrations. We need a consistent, coherent foreign policy. And we need to think about the interest of the entire region, because we don't exist in a vacuum. And that's one of my biggest concerns with how we've been handling this.
Yeah, we'll go back to that for sure. Renee?
Thank you. And thank you to FIU. So I want to peel this apart a little bit, because there are three players in the region that are challenging US influence there. There's China, which we've talked a lot about. There's Russia, and there's still Iran. So I'm going to start with just a big picture, and that is this has been going on forever. That's why there's a Monroe Doctrine. During the Soviet era, we had all kinds of tit for tat between the US and the Soviet Union in Latin America. With the breakup of the Soviet Union, the US felt like, okay, we're safe now. And that's when we looked away. And when we looked away, that's when China said, aha, it's our moment. And it was also the moment when China was becoming more powerful. And China had a longer term plan. I remember being an analyst. I've been following this for over 25 years. Being an analyst and saying, wait a minute, just as you saw with our FIU students up here, showing what China was doing economically, we were doing that by hand. We didn't have the dashboard. We were doing that by hand and showing the encroachment that was going on with China in the region. And we'd bring that to Washington. I was down here at Southcom working it. We'd bring it to Washington, and we'd get, that's just regular trade. It's regular economics. Nothing to worry about. And we kept saying, but wait. They're going into all those areas that are important, where the key infrastructure is. And people weren't listening. Then we saw Russia come in. It was about the time of Putin, once Putin consolidated power. Russia had gone through their breakup, and Russia came in. Russia had a different approach. They didn't have the money that China had. China was already in the area. Russia did the same tactics that they had done back during the Soviet era. And that was more the irregular warfare type of tactics. Their focus was disinformation, using media and social media in the region to get a narrative that was an anti-US narrative. They built more RT stations throughout the region. Even today, they offer money to journalists to go to put in articles into local papers. They offer free workshops. So there's a key disinformation part, which is that gray zone area. And then the Russians are a lot more in your face with the US. They upped the ante when it came to military ties, especially among the three major countries that they have key ties with, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. You saw them sign mill-to-mill agreements and place their folks, whether proxies or increase military folks in all those countries. And then finally, when it comes to Iran, Iran's long used the region as an area where they can make money and move money. And that's what the region is largely what the region is for. jury's out on what's going to happen with what else is going on in Iran right now. So the future with Iran being an influence in the region, I think is up in the air. But that's the big picture.
Right.
Yeah, thank you. Vladimir?
Yes, thank you again for FIU to having us here, but I also would like to thank the organizers for thinking well about the agenda. I think what we are talking now it's a good complement to what been discussed before us. So I will not repeat all those ideas, of course, but I would like to emphasize some of the differences that I believe sometimes are missed. First of all, yes, I do agree with you that the external powers here, it's not something new. We've been here before. The Soviet experience, of course, is very much relevant. At least 2 or 3 times I've heard yesterday mentioning of the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, which Moscow loved to go back and back and back. But I think Russia-China strategies are very much different from what the Soviet Union was doing here. And this is important always to take into consideration. And they're different because, and that's something also I would like to thank the organizer. This networking breakfast sometimes are so useful because I've been talking to one of the participants. Why were we actually discussing the presence of the external powers in the Western Hemisphere? And I think that the questions we have to answer as well. Why China, Russia, Iran, and some other external power are interested in the Western Hemisphere? Mm-hmm. And the answer is very clear, because we are living in the age of the global rivalry, geopolitics are back, and they, of course, are well aware that that's the same neighborhood we share with the United States and with Latin American countries. So this is the first point I would like to mention. The second, yes, you're right saying that the 1990s, we in Latin America felt that we are sort of abandoned. But it's not only China and Russia that rushed into the space. There was also Latin Americans looking for new possibilities. And I think that dimension of the process is also important to take into consideration. Because what those external powers understand very quickly, that they can exploit those vulnerabilities that exist in Latin America. And this is a big difference, I think, what we found with Martin and some of the reports I've been working with. Yes, China also interested in money. Money making is there. But as you mentioned, we have to look where the investments go, what kind of dependency they create. Mm-hmm. So this is sort of like killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Of course, gaining money, getting money for the Chinese industry, replacing the traditional economic relationships that existed with the United States and other Western powers, but at the same time having this sort of control over the very sensitive security process that are taking place. And I would also suggest that we have to move this timeline a little bit back in the 1990s, and it's particularly important for Russia. Russia obviously is not China. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have the same economic might, but for those, I would say, 20, 25 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they have developed a very particular modus operandi. They realize very quickly they can't compete with China. They can't compete with many other actors. So what they do, they create dependency with very, very sensitive areas. So they use those dependencies shamelessly, right, in order to gain the political, the actives, the things they want politically from those countries. And all of this camouflage within these narratives of multipolar world, of Russia being supporter of the global South. And I think the last but not least, we have to work even more in order to raise awareness of the real intentions of China and Russia and Iran and some other countries. So we have to actually fight those narratives that are promoted by those countries and unfortunately supported by some of people, even experts in Latin America, that saying, well, it's actually a very legal process. You know, we have to compete. We have to open the space for those actors. If we understand what they're looking for, I think this will provide us with the opportunity to just explain the decision makers what is behind of all this. Thank you.
Martin, sorry to leave you for last, but yeah.
Yeah.
Last but not least, well, I would like to also thank the FIU for cooperating with us. We just signed an MOU between CSD and FIU 2 days ago, and I'm especially grateful to the leadership of Brian Fonseca. This is the kind of evidence-based research that was shown before that CSD is also aiming at and has been trying to do in different regions of the world. And this is what we have missed for the last 20 years, this acute understanding of what has been happening in terms of geoeconomic realignment. So today is actually a strange day. Today is the day when Vladimir Putin came to power. He was sworn in as president 26 years ago. A year later, China joined the WTO. This is not a coincidence that in the past 25 years, we have moved from the US being the main trading partner to most countries in Latin America to China being the biggest partner, with the exception of Mexico and a few others. And this has happened without us knowing about it, almost. I think 10 years ago, no one was discussing these problems. They became much more, I would say, prevalent only after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this coincided not only with an attempt to counter Russian presence and Russian footprint in different parts of the world, but also with an increasing understanding that we need to follow a similar path of de-risking and even decoupling from China in different areas. But we have been very slow to actually act. And since 2022, especially in the case of Russia, Russia has tried to find new ways to reinvent its business partnerships, its political commitments outside of Europe, because Europe has gradually decoupled its dependence on Russia. So these capitals, which are in the hundreds of billions of dollars of foreign direct investment, have to be moved somewhere else. And so Russia has tried to aggressively penetrate Africa, Latin America, even places in East Asia. Brazil now is the biggest importer of Russian fertilizers in the world. Yeah. Russian petroleum products make up most of the supply in places like Brazil, even Bolivia, Argentina. Brazil is the 5th largest contributor to the Kremlin's war effort, according to our assessment. So yes, Russia is a minor economic player compared to China, but it's not entirely out of the game because, as you mentioned, they lock in countries in these long-term asymmetric supply arrangements, which are then exploited to achieve an outsized political influence. China does this on a much grander scale. Yep. And China, I think, is fighting for dominance in the critical sector, the emerging sectors that would kind of dominate the economic development pathways of the region for the foreseeable future. This is critical raw materials, nuclear energy, space technologies, cyber technologies. This is where China might have the upper hand still. If we look at nuclear energy projects in Argentina, who is in pole position? And at least until Milei was obviously China. Brazil is cooperating with both Russia and China on nuclear. I can go on and go on. I mean, Venezuela is indebted to I think, to $100 billion to China. How is Venezuela going to pay this money? So there's still many instruments for China and Russia to continue projecting power. And this is only the economy. We're not even mentioning the sharp power instruments that you already talked about, media disinformation, but also, co-opting of elites, political, cultural elites, and changing the public debate on critical strategic issues. Yep. And then finally, in what we published just 2 days ago here with the colleagues, Vladimir is also part of this great assessment of illicit activities and how Russia and China and Iran are using illicit actors to undermine political stability, coherence of democratic institutions. And so the US, yes, has reasserted its dominance in the region. Obviously, the national strategy of the US shows that clearly the actions in Venezuela, but only coercion would not be enough. There needs to be a kind of a constructive strategy to offer incentives, to offer alternatives to all these governments, to also try to decouple or de-risk their relationships with these authoritarian states.
Thank you so much, yeah. So I'm going to have a some questions more pointed at each of you, but feel free to jump in, obviously. One of the things that I think, at least from my perspective as a reporter, has been the most interesting is, again, there's been this intense focus on the hemisphere now. Obviously, generally, people think that's a good thing, that it's been neglected for too long, but it's also being used, a lot of the rhetoric around it is also often used for political ends, and it's also kind of imprecise. So sometimes, whether it's oil, economics, whatever often this administration is speaking about, sometimes it's unclear if it's an operational threat or if they're using the threat of China, the threat of Russia, Iran as a, kind of a boogeyman sometimes to justify other kinds of actions. And I'm curious for you, Rafael, I mean, the issue of Cuba is so interesting because the president signed an order in January saying that Cuba presents an extraordinary national security threat to the United States. A lot of people say that is really overstated in terms of the actual threat that Cuba itself could pose. I know you have written about this in terms of, obviously, Cuba itself as a base or an ally for some of these external actors. I'd be curious what you think about the rhetoric, the operational threat.
The question of Cuba is anything but rhetorical. It's a clear and present danger to the interests of the United States and to our national security. Much to our detriment, we've actually undermined and played down the strategic importance of Cuba and its geoeconomic, geopolitical, and military importance in the Caribbean. And because of its position, it has an advantage over many other countries, and it serves as a proxy to many of our foreign adversaries and our adversarial threats. The question is, we keep saying Cuba is not a threat, but then we have cases like Ana Belén Montes, right? And we have ambassadors that have been basically approached by foreign actors and recruited into their intelligence services. The fact of the matter is, Cuba is the head of the snake. And for far too long, we've allowed this whimsical, laissez-faire attitude and taken sort of a back seat to the whole question of Cuba. Cuba must be free. We cannot have a socialist, communist regime, a totalitarian regime 90 miles south of us. And this is above and beyond partisan politics. We need to look at this as Americans and look at our interests across the board, right? Fidel Castro in the past placed his country under a nuclear threat. He literally wanted to have the Russians, or the USSR at the time, attack the United States and use those missiles and had them pointed toward us. Right now, they are in a position to conduct electromagnetic pulse attacks, denial of service hacks through the PLA units that are in Cuba right now. And this is a reality. This is not myth. It's a fact. They have the ability to literally take down our banking system. They have the ability to take down our ports because they know the code that's there, that's embedded in the critical machines that move. They can close down the port of New Orleans. What happens to our oil reserves then? We need to think about this as long-term strategy, not just immediate gain. And we really, really need to get into the business of developing partnerships with the private sector, real partnerships, because deindustrialization has a cost. We see it today. We see it in the Iron Belt states where fentanyl has become a problem in the very deindustrialized zones across America. We need to start developing a coherent strategy of decoupling with China and bringing those industries to the Americas. When I say the Americas, I mean the hemisphere, to create opportunities across all of LATAM and the Caribbean. The Caribbean basin can boom economically with some of the changes that we need to make in our relationship with China. We need to lessen the dependency on the big Asian power right now, relocate some of those industries, mission-critical industries and production, including to the territory of Puerto Rico, which is a U.S. territory. I don't know why, just for the sake of balancing the budget, one president just eliminated Section 936 of the IRS tax code and thereby it deindustrialized all of the pharmaceuticals that were located in Puerto Rico. They left. These are political stunts that are costing our nation. So people say that elections have consequences. My friends, deindustrialization and lack of coherence in economics and geoeconomics have further implications. We're looking at it today. Cuba still has a socialist, a revolutionary government in place that had been part of the problem across the Americas. They've created the Movimiento 19, M19. They've been a host to the FARC. They've had the Basque Etarras living there in clandestinity. They've had all forms of revolutionary movements housed there right under our noses, 90 miles south of us. This is anything but rhetorical. It's a real clear and present danger. We have to face it. We have to shut it down once and for all and turn that country into what it once began to be, which is the Monaco of the Caribbean.
If I can add to that on Cuba as a threat, I 100% agree. It is not rhetorical, and you touched on this. Housed on Cuba is listening posts for both Russia and China. They have the ability to focus in on all of the important southern military commands that we have here, bases, et cetera. So not only can they shut things down, they're also listening to what's going on in all these important intelligence areas for the United States. And that also needs to be shut down.
That's right.
I think, sorry.
Sorry, just one more point, something that I was already telling here. Cuba managed, unfortunately, to gain a kind of high level of solidarity among Latin Americans, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
They, unfortunately, and I would say it again, but they're doing a very good job in order to position themselves in the way which completely wrong about what Cuba is and what Cuba is doing. But they're very good in that. One of the reasons of the disaster of the economic situation, of the catastrophe Cuban people have, is precisely of the dependence that the Soviet Union created back in the times of the Cold War. So we have to make efforts to explain also this. We have to also work with Latin America, because otherwise it would be very difficult to do whatever might happen to Cuba, right? We need to get this support from Latin America.
To me, one of the most tangible things that I reported on, which I think sometimes people just kind of, even though it's real, it does feel like words unless you have a story that illustrates it, was the hundreds of Cuban mercenaries who basically were sent to fight in Ukraine on behalf of Russia. And I thought that was, reporting on those.
It's at least the latest figures I saw were in the thousands.
It's in the thousands.
In the thousands, yeah. So, kind of reporting on things like that where people understand that, I think sometimes is a more tangible way to get at it. Renee, I wanted to kind of follow up on that. I mean, we're discussing this just through the context of Cuba, for example, but when we're looking at all of these external powers, sometimes we see them all as separate threats in separate lanes, right? We think China is economical, they have all this economic tentacles, they're sinking into the region. Russia is usually more seen as disinformation these days, as creating a different kind of chaos. Iran sometimes as terrorism, cartels as crime. But ultimately, I mean, aren't they all increasingly overlapping? Aren't they all kind of feeding off each other in the vacuum?
They are. I don't think you could say that they're working together per se.
Right.
But the overlapping is a really good way of describing it.
Yep.
And there are parts I sometimes wonder, do they also sort of trip over each other as they're doing this? Because you see, one of the ways of influence in gaining power is, for example, doing military training for the countries in Latin America. And you see Russia, China, and to some extent Iran, used to be, bringing folks in from Latin America to do training in their places. How much is there overlap there? Are they sort of falling over each other? But they send those folks, then those folks go back and they become more senior military officers, and they've got that training from these other countries, which is fascinating. You don't see, I don't know that you'd see the overlap so much on the social media side, maybe a little bit with Iran and Russia. I don't see as much with China, and I think it's largely a language issue there. But you also can see it with, again, on the diplomacy side, and I think you talked a little bit about that. So the idea in the non-aligned movement is not a big deal anymore. It used to be a big deal, but there are other ways that both Russia and China are bringing together those folks that aren't happy with the United States, that are trying to do their own thing and not be under the U.S. power to say. So you see them, that's where they do work together, and that's an area where you know, the United States could work a little harder on and be a good partner and not an overwhelming partner. And that is something that Russia and China do a good job at least on the outside, being more of a good partner while they sort of infiltrate. And then the last thing I want to talk about is a little bit about the infrastructure. So you've had, for years, and well, in Cuba still, and in Venezuela, both Russian and Chinese engineers putting together the infrastructure throughout the region. We talked about this a little bit yesterday. Cheaper, easier to get the contracts, et cetera. Well, with that infrastructure, being a good intel person, I would say there's stuff in that infrastructure. Stuff that can be shut off easily or used to listen, sensors, et cetera. How much that overlaps with each other would be fascinating to know. You know, are they working together on that? Or do they trip over each other in that area? So.
Yeah, and, sorry.
If I may, just to add to what Renee was just saying right now, which is spot on. In the case of Cuba, for example, just as an example, the reconstruction of Cuba from an infrastructure standpoint will require, and estimates range from $70 to $100 billion initially, as far as mission critical infrastructure. We're looking at the roads, we're looking at electric power, we're looking at telecoms, and everything that you need really to set up shop to then go in there and usher in a democratic civil society, right? Operating under a free Cuba, of course. I'm not saying go in there now with the regime in place. There can be no business with assassins and murderers that are in place right now. They must be outed, they must be ousted, and then we need to establish free and fair elections once the people are ready to do that. But there has to be some sort of transition, and the United States has to play a role, because if we do not, then we're opening the way, we're basically paving the way for other actors to come in and leverage that telecom infrastructure that they have to steal our IP. And then that goes back to how we've been losing our advantage, our strategic competitive advantage as a nation, because our taxpayer-funded research and development initiatives that take decades for the fifth generation fighter jets, for example. Look at how the Chinese have literally copied what we've developed and cost us years to develop, and all of the different components. I mean, this has to stop. We need to protect our intellectual property because it is the backbone of our national industrial program. Without it, we're losing this whole battle, this whole war.
Yeah.
Just to add to this, perhaps some kind of a different dimension to this. I think there is no, at least I don't have any evidence that I can present here that there has been some kind of coordination of the policies that are conducted by China, by Russia, some others. They certainly do not contradict each other, but they also have something in common, and I think this is important to take into consideration. They're very knowledgeable about what is happening in the region. You can see Chinese going and to negotiate on the regional level, for example, in Colombia. I observe it all the time. They know all the names of the regional government. They know people who are in charge of what. They go directly, they talk to those people. So this is a sort of penetration we see, right? And the other thing, I think the deputy director mentioned something very important also today in the morning before us. She was telling about the speed, right? And I think when we look at Nicaragua, when we look at some other places where Russian are present and Chinese are present, and we don't see for now some kind of alert that would trigger some kind of immediate response, we should be also aware that they know perfectly when to strike, and they look for the opportunities, and they position through the networks to do this perfectly.
Yeah.
So I think this is a real
I'll go back to that because that's really interesting. But Martin, sorry, on that front, I think one of the most interesting things is that, you know, we're talking a lot about Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. I think all of those have obvious incentives to be allowing a lot of this. But even when you look at some of the most conservative or even the most aligned with, like openly aligned with the Trump administration countries, you've got Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, you've got Javier Milei in Argentina. You go to the capital of El Salvador and they have this massive Chinese-built library. They have the Chinese flag flying. You go to Argentina, and even though Milei campaigned on aligning with the United States, like ultimately this penetration, this economic infrastructure we've talked about that they developed for decades is not going to be torn out from one day to the next. How, I'd be curious for your thoughts on how the US can offer real credible alternatives for financing, for everything else. It's obviously maybe a generational project. It's not something you can do, from one year to the other, but I'm curious about that.
Well, I think the first step is dismantling the state capture networks within these countries that are enabling corrosive capital coming from China or from Russia to take advantage of these deficits and lock countries into these long-term agreements, in these long-term projects. Usually the US companies or the EU companies, I'm saying usually because everyone takes advantage of state capture, but they tend not to be so aggressive in doing that. So you saw how in Bolivia, Western companies were basically sidelined during the Mas rule for the development of the lithium resources. And I think to the point that you guys have raised on cooperation, China and Russia are very well cooperating in Bolivia on lithium. They were able to, and I think Vera, you have done great reporting on that. They have basically been able to dominate the public procurement contracts around lithium exploration. Similarly, PDVSA's relationship in Venezuela with both China and Russia point to infiltration from the inside. So you have the executives of these state-owned companies, not only in Venezuela, but all across the region, they have an incentive to actually partner with a powerful country or state-owned company from China or Russia, because this gives them leeway for kind of deliver very quickly on a major project and benefit themselves. And these networks, because they are very much linked to government circles, to the central government, this creates a spillover effect. It's not a surprise that a state-owned energy company official signs a contract with Rosneft. These people are then going to deliver funds to networks that are part of the ruling elite. And of course, the ruling elite will then have to abide by these agreements, have to look the other way if China or Russia are doing some sketchy things in the illicit space. So the first step is dismantling state capture networks, improving governance systems, democratic institutions. So that's so important now to see a transition period in Venezuela, because otherwise the current state capture networks are very much alive and well. The second element, I think, is that in order to fight a footprint, you need to fight with footprint. There needs to be also some kind of a US centrally state-coordinated foreign investment action, similar to the one that China and Russia are exercising. I think we see that in Venezuela, this kind of concentrated push for US companies to gain traction in the country. Because this is the name of the game in the current multipolar world, where you don't have the domination of international kind of economic institutions like the World Trade Organization, IMF. You get into this more transactional approach. And I think this is fine. If the US and the EU don't adopt some of this transactional approach, they're going to lose out to China and Russia. Right. This means that sometimes you need to look the other way in order to gain control of a strategic resource or strategic sector, but then use this new capital, this constructive capital, say, to change the market environment. Because these players, they bring with themselves not only investment, not only capital, they bring knowledge, they bring different rules to the game. And we have seen that in Costa Rica. I was in Costa Rica last year for a conference. Yes. Why is Costa Rica so different? In my opinion, it's because you have a giant Intel manufacturing plant in the middle of San Jose. Would you have this alignment with the US in Costa Rica if you didn't have that strategic investment? So you need to fight footprint with footprint.
Yeah. Just to add a few things to what Martin was saying, I think this is also crucial. where we look for this malign influence of those actors. Because we look at the big numbers, we look about the trade, we look about infrastructure. This is all things we have to do, and we see a very beautiful work actually done by a student here at FIU with this database. But to find actually what is the most dangerous, we have to look in those areas of vulnerability in Latin American countries, right? Because that's what they are after. And they look to actually to exploit those vulnerability. And what we did with Martin, with his team, we started looking at those gray area, those shadow networks, and immediately we find those footprints. I think it's also very important that we look at this. And last but not least, you mentioned Bolivia, and I think it's very interesting because we've been discussing also yesterday with you and some other people here, how can we, what kind of instruments we can have, how we can react to this, right? And for example, in the case of Bolivia, Russia is very sensitive to eventually, if there will be loss of those presence in Bolivia, because they do not have, or very few possibilities to get lithium otherwise. So we can actually, to do something on the global stage and do something that would actually be very, very sensible for Russia. Because for now, they feel very, very much protected in doing things they do, using those narratives and doing things they've been doing for the last years.
Rafael, I have just to kind of go on to that. I mean, one of the approaches we've seen a lot with this current administration and this new focus has been also quite coercive. It's been, on the one hand, it's tariffs, punishments, like threats when it comes to trying to push them away from China, from some of these things. I'm curious whether you think, what the balance is there between blocking Chinese projects or punishing countries or trying to basically use these more coercive tools versus making US or allied alternatives more competitive?
I think it has to be a combination of the two. But we have to start looking at deterrence more so from an economic perspective. And that's some of the things that Commander Gutierrez and I have focused on at the Miami Strategic Intelligence Institute. We've looked at deterrence, the deterrence economics as a new realm. Not just the military portion of it, right? And also, when you look at deterrence from an economic perspective, you look at the need that we have to develop a critical mineral standard, and how the critical mineral standard, above all in the lithium triangle, for example, in South America, could play a major role in the redevelopment of nations such as Bolivia, which was headed into a catastrophe under the Movimiento al Socialismo and under Evo Morales, and thank God we have a new president in Bolivia now that actually has common sense. And we have to look at what the trade-offs are going to be if they go these different routes. So we need to create a situation for our partner nations where we're actually helping them instead of just rhetorically addressing the issue. So I agree with you on that one. But we have to create alternatives. We have to create alternatives that are feasible and a long-term strategy. Guatemala needs our support. I heard their Minister of Defense speak very eloquently about the assistance that the United States government has provided on the counter-narcotics and intelligence sharing and equipment. Well, above and beyond that, we also need to provide technological assistance. Costa Rica opened the way for privatization in 2008 of the telecoms law when President Arias signed it into law. But what happened was, and I was there monitoring this on the ground because I've been heavily involved in mission critical infrastructure for years. I've been involved in the construction of it. And from that perspective, I'm not just speaking academically, I've actually built out infrastructure. I've been projects director as an economist. And I saw how the Chinese came in and basically bribed their way into the country, and they outbid Nextel and other firms that we should have been supporting. Now, kudos to Ambassador Bernie Navarro, now who recently helped close a deal promoting fighter jets for the United States. Our ambassadors need to be in the business of helping commercial ties become strengthened, okay? And we're also gonna be needing something that I call cyber attachés at the local US embassies to look out for cybersecurity and really escalate cybersecurity to that level. We have a cybercom. Why don't we have cyber attachés at every single US embassy is beyond me at this point. That is a big, big pressing need. Cybersecurity is a big area, And it's one of our biggest vulnerabilities right now with respect to foreign actors in the region. But yes, I think that's the way to do it. We need to look at deterrence from an economic standpoint. We need to look at scenarios that are not just immediate and reactive by nature, right? Knee-jerk reacting is not gonna get us where we need to go. We need a coherent and intelligent strategy that we can play out over time, and we have to learn how to play we have to learn how to play Go, not checkers, as Admiral Studman wisely pointed out in his essay that he wrote for our magazine. We need to learn how to play the long game, something that China does well.
Right, and kind of,
Yeah, I was just going to say, I do think we still need that coercive language. And I agree that we need both. But the coercive language, I view the audience is not being the Latin American governments. It's Russia and China.
Right.
And you do see, I'm not privy to any of the stuff going on anymore behind the scenes, but you do see hints that there are talks going on behind the scenes, so that hopefully the governments understand that coercive language, yeah, we're putting you on notice, but we're really putting Russia and China on notice. And we're willing to work with you.
right.
That's right.
So I think we have to understand it's a little more nuanced.
Yes.
If I can jump in, another element which we need to focus on is countering illicit financial flows within the region, because they are the enabling kind of tools for making sure that this footprint becomes operational and these agreements and these projects happen. And on the one side, you have transnational organized crime networks, of course, and their money laundering operations that use Chinese payment systems, that use also crypto and new payment structures that are emerging as we speak. Some of them operate by Russia. But we're talking also about more general kind of offshore-based financing in the region, which is still huge. We talk about the Western Hemisphere as if the Caribbean is not there, but the Caribbean is a major part of this area, and it is still very much a hub for illicit financial flows. And the major users of that are actually China and Russia and Iran. And so there needs to be a more proactive kind of work on the part of the US government, also European government, because a lot of the money then flow to Europe as well, to kind of counter these practices by improving ultimate beneficial ownership registries, providing more transparency, exposing some of these ties. You know, when the Panama Papers came out in 2016, 2 years later, 90% of the Russian businesses that were moving money to Panama disappeared. They moved next door to the BVI. But I mean, and the BVI is ruled by kind of a narco, dictator. And no one has done anything about it. Actually, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've seen a 10% increase in offshore funds, Russian offshore funds moving to the BVI to $70 billion, even though most of the companies there are under sanctions. So, I mean, there seems to be lack of coherence a little bit in following up with some of these sanctions measures. Yeah, and just one last point. I think what is happening right now in terms of the new corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is that it's already a global thing. It's not only about the Western Hemisphere. If you follow kind of the actions of the Trump administration in Venezuela, it's not only about Venezuela, it's about oil supplies to China. It's about Iranian-Venezuelan cooperation on oil, on drones, on Hezbollah. So it's a wider game. Cuba is the same thing. And the key element here is, again, illicit financial flows that are based on oil trading via shadow fleets, via intermediaries that try to evade sanctions. So this global network of sanctions need to be strengthened, and local governments can help that. And this kind of cooperation, as you mentioned, could be a way forward in this direction.
Just two quick thoughts about global dimension. We know that, of course, Russia, China, Iran, and some other external powers are looking to expand their presence in one way or another in the Western Hemisphere. But I also see the evidences that those countries are using the Western Hemisphere, Latin America, and the Caribbean, in that sense, as a kind of a testing ground, because they think it's much more easier for them to test some of the tools, the use of some of the tools in some other countries. One of the reasons I already mentioned, because of less awareness among Latin American policymakers about the danger that represent those. The other point is about people, about migration. I think we will have another panel in the afternoon dedicated to migration here. But Latin America and the Caribbean, it's not the case of China, as far as I know, and I have to check the recent agreements that they have with the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. But Russian nationals can move freely everywhere in Latin America. So you can find those people moving from one country to another, making it actually global connections and moving with the knowledge they have, both in Europe, both in the United States and also in Latin America. We see a tremendous increase of Russian nationals being present actually in Latin America. So I think something must be done at least in that sense, because of course Russians celebrate this saying, look, Latin America is so friendly to us, we don't need any visa, we can just jump into plane. When they can, of course, because it's difficult.
And there is a correlation between the migration flows from Russia and the rise in Russian spies. The number of Russian spies in Mexico. Mexico has become the biggest hub for Russian spies. Who would think? I mean, the Soviet times there was tradition, but nowadays the numbers are staggering.
And also transnational networks. I mean, illegal crime groups and those organized groups, they take a full advantage of the freedom they have in the region.
So this is where I can jump in on the money side.
Okay.
Having worked this issue for the US government for many years, we were always the ones that got the least amount of money, and we're always begging. So the fact that you don't have US government paying as much attention to the sanctions issues, for example, there's just not the money there. And even though there's been a change in the national security strategy and defense strategy, and there is some more money going towards that, it's nowhere near what it needs to be. And that's for government officials to be able to work these issues, as well as funds to help the region.
Absolutely.
So it's not all money also going to the region. There also needs to be more money going towards hiring the right people to do the work.
Human capital.
And to be able to focus on the region.
I mean, I'll start with you with this question, but feel free to jump in. We're talking about this because of the issue of the subject matter, like it's like Latin America is kind of a blank slate and all these great powers are kind of playing around, but there's still pretty powerful other groups there, right? We've got transnational groups, as you said, we've got criminal groups, cartels, and they get a say to an extent in a lot of what happens there. I'd be curious when we are talking about these external powers, whether some of them are actively using criminal networks in the Americas or often just kind of exploiting the instability that they create for their goals. I'm sure it's both, but I'd be curious for your thoughts.
Yeah, I was going to say absolutely both.
Yeah.
I mean, you see that with Iran, and you've seen from terrorist activities that's taken place in the region, as well as arrests of folks laundering money that are tied to the different terrorist groups, Islamic terrorist groups. Russia, absolutely. I mean, Russian organized crime is so involved with transnational organized crime. And then China, and where's the fentanyl precursors coming from? So absolutely, there's a connection there.
The financial component to that, just with the cartels, for example, right? Who launders the money for the cartels in Mexico and other places? Who launders the money? It's the Chinese banks. And so there is absolutely a synergistic relationship between these proxies and these transnational criminal organizations that operate with impunity within certain territories, right? With the approval, if you will, for a small fee, of course, for a small management fee from the local regimes. And that needs to end. So yes, there are times when we need to punch people in the nose and get things done from a kinetic standpoint, but there's also a lot of consequential things that we need to put into place, as we've been discussing here, to make it a long-term play.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the PR, because I just wanted to mention that we just published 2 days ago a special assessment of the links between foreign authoritarian states and transnational organized crime networks in the region. And I want to give just two examples, both from Mexico. One is that we investigated an arms transfer network linked to Victor Bout, the famous Russian criminal that was extradited back to Russia in a exchange facilitated by the Wall Street Journal, I remember, I think, last year. Well, his network was caught delivering tens of millions of dollars worth of firearms to the Jalisco cartel. And this has been happening probably on a regular basis. So, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there has been a huge amount of weapons flowing around. And some of these cartels are also going to Ukraine to learn some of the new military tactics. In Colombia, we see that very often. Drones are being introduced by both guerrilla groups and by drug cartels. And armies in Latin America are not prepared for this new type of warfare. And on the shadow fleets, also, drug cartels are using the playbook of the Russians on how to hide ships and move, for example, illegal petroleum products around from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And some of the intermediaries are the same ones that have been moving Venezuelan oil before. So there's very good integration right now, and it's still a largely unstudied topic because there is very little evidence on the ground, so we need to rely mainly on court documents and media publications. So there needs to be more kind of data-driven, systematic overview of all these trends.
Just a few more thoughts on that. I think one of the very sensitive areas for any country in the Western Hemisphere is called drug trafficking, right? And Russians were there at least since the second part of the 1990s when they signed an agreement, an alternative agreement to the agreement that Colombia used to have with the United States to fight illegal drug traffickers, Russians, right? And then, of course, have all these networks in Nicaragua, and they know perfectly what is happening in the field. Colombia still, it does not make headlines, but Colombia does extradite people to Russia. So what happened to those? I mean, we know how the law authorities work in Russia. It's a joke, right, in this certain sense. And the last but not least, at least in the case of Russia, and I think to a certain extent also China and some other, those governments do not hesitate to work with legal crime. It's just perfectly normal for them.
As we're wrapping up, No. So one of the last things we've spoken a lot about narratives about pro-America, anti-America, all of that. We talked about it at the beginning, but I'm very curious, again, a lot of the actions that this administration has taken in terms of resources, in terms of very transactional foreign policy and prioritizing that over, democracy, things like that. How much this is helping external powers, China, Russia, kind of really disseminate those narratives and really kind of, again, press all of those old, decades-old sensitivities, especially, maybe Vladimir, you're well positioned. What do you think the impact of that has been? Because it's been a gift to an extent.
Well, I think we are facing a crucial moment at this point. That's why we're talking about shifting the security landscape. And again, the speed of those processes is really going very, very fast. It's a different story that it was in the 1990s. We're in 2026. All those powers are very well positioned in the area. So what I think we have to do actually, in the first place, to do the investigative work. I mean, you journalists are very, very helpful in this because you're doing a great job. Sometimes you publish things that governments, for whatever reason, hesitate to actually make public. So we know that this work is very important. Also think tanks, also university. I'm based at the university. So I think those are very important. And very, very important, once again, I think we should look for the way to make alliances with Latin American partners, between Latin America and the United States. I think this is the key. And then it's actually helps to fight those narratives that come in from Russia, that come in from China about new multiple world order, and that those countries are free to decide. They're free to decide, but they're also free to decide which interests they have. And I think the answer is very clear.
I'll give you 30 seconds.
I think that there are 3 areas that we need to focus on to ensure continuity of leadership in the area of responsibility. We need to get back into the business of shipbuilding and maintain naval superiority. That's very, very important to our strategic interests. Number 2, we need to be in the business of allocating the necessary resources to uphold the technology that will substantiate leadership in artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence doesn't just happen in a vacuum. There's infrastructure tied to that. So we need to develop partnerships with the private sector and provide incentives for them to set up shop here in America and in the Western Hemisphere to maintain that leadership. And then, of course, artificial intelligence, naval superiority. If you don't control the oceans, if you don't control the seas, you can't be the leading power in the world. That's very important.
Well, thank you again. This is a great event. It's been interesting to see so many of these events take place in Miami. I feel like we're going to see a lot more of it. So always feel free to reach out to me. My colleagues and I are covering this overlap of Latin America and national security incredibly closely for a long time now. So thank you again. Thank you for all the panelists.
Good.